you spend a lot of time telling stories. And storytelling is the best way to put meat on the bones of statistics and factual records, all of which are necessary and all of which you marshal to enormously great effect. But basically what you do is you tell stories. You talk about your trip across America. And one of the ways to read the book is it's a road book. It's a travel book. It's a journey you personally took, in which you engaged in many Americans, black and white and all shades in between, about their experience of racial justice in America and what they've seen and what they deal with every day. So to help along this conversation, let's start with one of the stories you tell. And the one that I found many of them resonant. This one in particular was a metaphor you call the drained swimming pool metaphor, and how it illustrates a willingness of some people to do without and to take loss so that others cannot gain. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, John. Thank you. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me this evening. And thank you to the nearly 200 folks who are spending some time on a beautiful Wednesday evening when they could be out frolicking and, drinking outside by a fire pit or something. And they're instead thinking about some of the thorniest problems in our society and how we can do better. So I really want to appreciate you for that, and to the Path Foundation for making this evening possible. So as John said, I come to these issues from the vantage point of really trying to address economic inequality. I want to know why we can't in America seem to have nice things for our people. And by nice things, I don't mean self-driving cars, which I actually don't think we need, or laundry that does itself, which I think would actually be great as I do my fourth load of the day right before I came here. But I mean things like help with childcare, truly universal and affordable healthcare, reliable world-class modern infrastructure, a well-funded public school in every neighborhood. These are the nice things that other societies with less than our wealth have somehow managed to figure out for their people in a more reliable and universal way. And after nearly 20 decades of trying to use economic policy tools, right? The research, the statistical analyses, the white papers, the congressional testimony, the legislative lobbying to try to just convince policymakers to do what was in the obvious best interest of our economy and our people who give so much to the economy and get so little out. I was kind of at a loss. And so I set out, as you said, John, on this journey across the country to figure out what am I missing? What's the deeper thing here that we're just not able to address with the tools that I had learned about in the kind of think tank world? And one of the first places I went was Montgomery, Alabama. Now, Montgomery, Alabama is one of the many, many places across the country that used to have, that benefited from a 1930s and 40s building boom that happened across the country of public amenities, public libraries, schools, parks, and swimming pools. And these are not the kind of swimming pools that I'm familiar with. These are swimming pools that would hold thousands of swimmers. They were just these massive, grand resort-style pools. And they were a big feature of the American landscape in that period. There were almost 2,000 of them across the country. And they were pools, but they were also in some ways kind of an example of the level of government investment in the public good, right? The idea that government would be able to make sure that most people had a decent standard of living. This was the ethos in the 30s and 40s. It was sort of the New Deal ethos that included rural electrification and a massive investment in the economic security and well-being and housing and retirement and labor rights for ordinary folks. But the public pool in Montgomery, Alabama, like in so many places, and like much of that New Deal social contract, from the housing subsidies to the labor protections, was for whites only. And that is a real hard truth about our Americans' very recent history that we so often don't recognize. But so the pool in the center of Montgomery, Alabama was called the Oak Park Pool. And I went there and walked the grounds of where that pool used to be, but was no longer. And it turns out that when in the late 1950s, early 1960s, across the country, Black families began to successfully sue and say, hey, those are our public tax dollars that are funding these public amenities. Our children should be able to swim too. Faced with an order to integrate, the good leaders of Montgomery, Alabama decided instead of integrating the pool, they would drain the public pool. They literally took out the water, filled it with dirt. And not only that, but because everything public now had to be shared across the color line, they decided to close the entire Parks and Recreation Department for a decade. They kept it closed. We were almost in 1970 before anybody in Montgomery could go to a park or a recreation center. They even sold off the animals in the zoo, John. And I tell that story because Montgomery was one of countless towns that did the same thing, tried to privatize their public pools. When that didn't work, just drain them. And it was the loss of these public goods that ended up making swimming, which, you know, is not like the most important thing in the list of all the things that we need, but is a symbol of a government commitment to a standard of living, and is also a place where people meet and become neighbors and citizens and build those community bonds. Instead of having public pools, then you had to be rich enough to build one in your backyard. And then you started seeing these members-only private swim clubs crop up all over. In fact, in the DC area, there were over 120 that came into being after pool integration. So that's the story of the drained public pool. And I'll tell you, there was nothing sadder than walking around those grounds. There were about 4 or 5 people in the entire park. It used to be the beating heart of the community. There were more groundskeepers than there were people. And just looking at what used to be and what was lost at a cost to everyone.
Yeah, that economic cost was borne by everybody. The loss of social structure, the loss of engagement with your own community, the loss of the friendly ties that people have and try to build and live across all racial lines. It was surprising. But the economics of this go even deeper. You tell another story, which is also, I thought, extremely compelling because it came from an origin of deep racial bias from Hinton Rowan Helper, who did work in pre-Civil War America on the economics of the American South. And tell us about what he found and where he was coming from in telling his story.
Oh, our good friend Hinton Rowan Helper. So, so this was really interesting to me. So I went back. So what I identified really at the outset of my journey was that the biggest impediment to economic progress and security in the country, to us being able to really have nice things, is a mentality and a worldview that is held by many Americans, more often white folks than people of color. And it's the view that this country is really not all one team, that actually there's an us and a them. And that there's a zero-sum competition between the us and the them. And that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense.
Right.
And so I went to try to figure out, well, where did that zero-sum story come from? We shouldn't just throw up our hands and say, yeah, that's just human nature, because it's not human nature. Everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And so I went all the way back to the prehistory of the United States to try to trace where this came from. And in my historical research, I hit upon this book. It was, a pamphlet-sized book that was very influential in the run-up to the Civil War, called The Impending Crisis of the South and How to Meet It, by Hinton Rowan Helper, who was a Southerner, who was quite racist in terms of he really believed that Black people were biologically inferior, but he hated slavery. And his book ended up being a very important sort of weapon in the abolitionist cause. He counted all of the public amenities in slave states versus free states to make the case that slavery was bad because it was impoverishing white Southerners. He took it upon himself to count how many schools, libraries, and other public institutions had been set up in free states versus slave states. So in Pennsylvania, for instance, he counted 393 public libraries. In South Carolina, just 26. In Maine, 236. In Georgia, just 38. New Hampshire had 2,381 public schools, and Mississippi just 782, right? This is a massive disparity, all out of whack with population. But this was the idea, right? That because you have this plantation economy, the wealthy elites of the plantation economy had no need to invest in the public goods for their community outside the plantation, right? You had an entirely captive, literally, labor force. You didn't want them educated. In fact, it was illegal to educate them. You only needed a handful of white workers. You didn't need them to be too educated because, your economic benefits were completely contingent on this sort of closed system of plantation agriculture that then was processed, and the customers were wage laborers in the North and then the global markets. And so it really made me realize, in fact, the very idea of public goods as a foundation for a thriving economy, the idea that we really adopted in this country in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, in the era when we created the greatest middle class the world had ever known, was totally antithetical to this plantation economy, where you still today have all of these disparities in southern states as compared to northern and western states, but also other research has shown that it's actually the slave counties that have lower per capita incomes today for white and Black folks than the counties that were enslaved states but didn't have plantations and active slavery. So
that's how the cost accrues to everybody, not just those oppressed.
Yeah.
You talk, and let's go back to that notion about the broad New Deal era and the creation of a broad expansion of the American middle class that took place in the aftermath of World War II and the efforts of public policy to advance those things. But it really started to erode during the civil rights era of the 1960s. There became a breakdown between what was, by any objective standard, an enormously successful series of public policies. The American middle class bloomed and expanded. This was the era that you described when massive public infrastructure projects like those pools were built in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But then what came after the 50s and the early 1960s was the broad expanse of civil rights legislation. And how did that affect Americans' support for these policies?
John, that's really it. So basically, this is the way I like to picture it. So those of us who study the economy and the recent economic history of the United States know that this era, the 1970s, 80s to today, is often termed the Inequality Era because it's an almost unprecedented sort of marching away with the economic gains of all of our economic efforts by the very wealthy. And you've seen stagnant and declining wages among working and middle class folks. Poverty has increased, economic insecurity has increased, and there's been very little, except with a few bright spots here and there, government support nor has there been a lot of labor organizing so that people can, be paid more on the job and have more of a say in their wages and benefits. But that was not the case in the era of shared prosperity. And what's often talked about then is a social contract, that there was this idea that big business said, you know what, we're going to pay our workers enough so that they can buy our products, right? This was Fordism, the idea that in our, the sort of backbone manufacturing, the jobs would be good enough to sustain a family, and that was great for the consumer economy, and everybody sort of benefited. It was sort of a bottom-up economic growth. And government was in on it. We're going to subsidize housing and transportation and education, right? All of these things. And then there was a high level of union density, and a lot, labor leaders were at the table for a bunch of big economic decisions. And so I literally picture the social contract as actually a piece of paper, probably a few pages, that is signed by three people. One representing government, so it'd be like the president of the United States, let's say it's Eisenhower. One representing labor, so it's the head of the UAW, at this time it would have been Walter Reuther, the United Auto Workers, and then maybe the head of GM, okay? And they sit down and they say, you know what? we're going to sign this contract for broadly shared prosperity. It's going to be sort of a grand bargain where everybody who puts in work is going to get a lot out of it. And we're going to just make sure that our people are doing well.
Right.
And it works, right? Biggest middle class the world has ever seen, made up of, people that we think of as white, but, a generation before had been immigrants of various European nations. And, they didn't have to go to college and they could have a great job for life and all of this, right? Subsidized suburbs and housing, GI Bill, it's great. Then there's a knock on the door. Literally, that's the way I picture it. There's a knock on the door, and it's because women and people of color are saying, hey, we would love to be a part of that contract. We have been doing a lot of work and not getting much for it. We would love to be a part of that contract. Could you please let us in? Maybe they stage a sit-in outside the door, and they get in, and then those three white guys, because that's who they were, right? Look around the table and they suddenly don't see themselves reflected anymore in the signatories. And so they get up, particularly government and business, get up and walk out the room and cut a side deal. And so then it's just workers, women, and people of color left holding the bag, and there's no longer that contract. That's the story that I see as a way to explain why there was this massive shift across really all of our major public policy areas, our tax policy, our trade policy, our industrial policy, the way we fund education, the way we fund housing. All of this had this complete shift really in the 1970s, accelerating in the 1980s, to make it harder for ordinary folks to get ahead, to pull back on the idea of government as a security, to make unions weaker, to make taxes lower on the wealthy, shifting the burden on to working and middle class folks. It was just this sort of total change. But the sum of us is my attempt to answer the why. Why would that happen? And a big piece of it was this idea of having to share the spoils of the country with the people that white Americans had been taught for generations to degrade and distrust and disdain. And I do say taught, John, and I think that's really important. Because as I said, everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And so throughout the book, I try to ask the question, well, who's telling this story? Who's telling a white worker on the line that there's something so wrong with the black guy, 3 seats down from him, that he shouldn't join a union with him, even though it'll mean better pay and better wages and better benefits for him, that there is this concerted effort, that the zero-sum story is a tool of propaganda by some of the worst elements in our society. And the goal is, as always, to divide working people from one another. The goal is to make sure that the economic rules keep being rigged towards the rich. And the goal is to stop people from working together and experiencing their power in numbers to change things to make it better for everyone.
Well, and all those abandonment of those policies in the aftermath of the 60s and 70s sort of accelerated in sort of a demonization of a demonization of the other, whoever the other may have been, and all the collective others that there might be. And that's helped lead to the housing crisis and the economic downturn of 2007. Talk about how that was accelerated by that process and the predatory nature of a lot of the lending policies that resulted.
Yeah, this is the issue. The book is divided into chapters. Each one is a different big meaty topic in our economy, whether it's education or housing or workers' rights. And there's a chapter in there called Ignoring the Canary that is probably the one that's the nearest and dearest to my heart, because it's the issue that I worked on for the first decade of my career. And that's the issue of what are the rules that lenders have to abide by when they enter into a contract or sell someone a loan for the most financially consequential thing in their lives, right?
Yeah. And the biggest wealth builder in American history has been the biggest thing that made the middle class was the opportunity to build wealth through the value of their home.
That's exactly right, John. And what we really have to keep in mind, and I tell this story in the book, is that big New Deal commitment to say that, hey, just a regular working stiff could own a house was something that was done on a racially exclusive basis. The government explicitly drew maps of the country and then drew lines around the Black neighborhoods and said, not only will we not guarantee any loans that are made in these neighborhoods. Literally told private capital, do not lend here. Right. Then they subsidized housing developments across the country and through the suburbs and said, we will not give you these subsidies, developers, if you don't include racially exclusive covenants barring Black people from living. Now, how could they get away with that? What is the idea? Right. It was because of a never substantiated idea that Black people were sort of inherently financially risky. Right. I tell that story because it's important, like it should be facts that everybody knows, because it helps explain so much of today's economic disparities, why it is that Black neighborhoods seem underinvested and undersupported. And Black families, are often one paycheck away from poverty because they don't have that wealth cushion because it was denied when the government was handing out the houses, basically. Oh. But I also tell that story because when you think about the logic, that racist logic, that Black people are equated with risk, that logic reared its ugly head again just 20 years after the last redlining maps were used, which was in the 1970s, when we started to see predatory mortgage loans that were way too expensive to be able to, be afforded long-term. Exactly. And I had a real front row to this crisis back when it was sort of the embers were the early ember or the early sparks, because it started first, the subprime mortgage crisis, which would then go on to engulf the entire economy, started first in Black neighborhoods. This is where the banks and the non-bank lenders tested out these new exotic loans. The idea that you could actually charge someone 10, 11, 12, 13% interest with an adjustable interest rate and a prepayment penalty and a balloon payment and all these crazy fees. They first targeted Black neighborhoods. And Black neighborhoods that were already homeowners, because what they wanted was to strip the equity, right? That was the biggest moneymaker with these refinance loans. And so the majority of the loans were refinance loans for people who are already homeowners. So that idea that it's like, oh, well, we put people into houses that they shouldn't have been able to afford, that was not it. It was actually existing homeowners who in many cases were doing just fine. Maybe wanted to refinance some credit card debt, maybe had a leaky roof, maybe were just called 10 times an hour until they finally said, sure, I'll refinance my loan. It seems like a good deal. And this is so important, and this is one of the things that if people take nothing away from reading the book, I hope they do. The majority of the loans, the subprime loans, the more expensive, less affordable loans, went to people who had good credit. It wasn't about risky people. It was about risky loans. But that's where that age-old racist stereotype that said Black people are credit risks made regulators look the other way, made it easy for these loans to not only be sold to borrowers, but then to be repackaged and sold onto Wall Street. And nobody really cared that these loans were ending up in foreclosure because it was people that kind of the ruling elite felt like, well, they've never really had houses before. Maybe they shouldn't have had the houses. It's so painful. And we know that the Black homeownership rate still hasn't recovered. It's back to what it was before the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This is one of those big pieces of unfinished business in racial justice that we've really got to get to. But I give this chapter at the heart of my book because we all know that the financial crisis cost everybody. Yeah. Cost 8 million jobs, $19 trillion in lost savings and wealth and pensions and houses. That chapter is filled with stories of white people whose lives were never the same because of the financial crisis. And I firmly believe that racism led to the financial crisis. And if it weren't for it, we wouldn't have let it happen.
And as I read your book, I was reminded of a book I'd read a number of years ago by Thomas Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas, where it basically, the premise there, although he gives no shrift to the notion that racism played a part of it, but he talked about how the notion of there being a pie and that it was a finite resource, and we want to make sure that we keep our share of the pie because anybody else getting a share of the pie is going to mean you get less. Yeah. Again, your zero-sum game, but without the obvious racial component to it that we all understand. He really didn't emphasize that. No. It was a very bleak book. And yours by comparison, is not bleak. You're very hopeful. Some of that, I presume, is your grounding in fact and in statistics, and you believe that numbers tell stories and that people need to understand those numbers and they can tell better stories. But if I expect it's more than that. So can you talk about why you feel there's opportunity here and why there's hope and why there's a way forward?
Well, I'll give two answers. One is why personally I'm just a hopeful person and kind of what I draw on to give me hope, even in, when the news is bleak. And then one is, and the second is, what I saw in my journey that gave me hope that hopefully comes through the page when folks read the book. The first is just that I am the descendant of enslaved people, and I'm sitting here, and talking to you, and have, a beautiful family. And you can't be in my shoes and not recognize that progress, though hard fought, is possible, and that my ancestors had to face so much more with so much less. So how could I possibly despair? So that's honestly what I do when I'm tempted by despair, is I really do think of my ancestors. And I bet everybody has a story of the people before them who had so much less. And that should give us hope. But I also found reason to hope in a much more external way in my journey, because I kept coming across people who were rejecting the zero sum.
Yes, great stories in the book about that.
Zero sum, right? I think of a woman named Bridget, who's from Kansas City. She's a lifelong fast food worker. And so we're talking about, people at the absolute bottom of the economic hierarchy in our society, making the minimum wage, derided as burger flippers. This is absolutely somebody who in many ways, had nothing to lose. And she had grown up really feeling, the zero sum story. She had believed the anti-immigrant, they're coming over here and taking our jobs and causing problems and committing crimes. And she also had no real hope that she would ever make more money or be more economically secure. She and her husband both worked minimum wage jobs. They had 3 kids. But then the fight for 15 began organizing in Kansas City. And she went to the first organizing meeting, even though she thought, no way are we ever going to get 15 for somebody like me. And she saw this Latina woman who stood up and told her story of her life living in an apartment with bad plumbing, with 3 kids and 2-bedroom apartment, and feeling trapped. And Bridget told me, I saw myself in her. And she said it was through organizing, through literally, making a list of demands of what could make the workplace better and what they really wanted, and then going and fighting for them together, white, black, and brown, as she always said, that she realized that it wasn't about us versus them. That in fact, as long as for us to come up, she told me, they've got to come up too. We've got to come up together. There's strength in numbers. As long as we're divided, we're conquered. And she even told me part of the whole point of this movement is for white workers to understand that racism hurts them too, because it keeps them divided from their brown and black brothers and sisters. This is an unbelievable transformation, and it came from cross-racial organizing. And I began to call what had happened in Bridget's life and the fact that they were able to win a wage increase at the municipal level a solidarity dividend. And that's the idea of these gains that can come when we link arms and recognize that our fights aren't identical, but they sure are close and interrelated. And that ultimately we've got to stand up for one another and have one another's backs.
I was, as you were speaking, I was reminded of a number of years ago, a senator who had been very harsh on LGBTQ rights, learned that a member of his family, a close member of his family, was gay, and he had a sort of road to Damascus conversion about gay rights and how this was very important, and got a lot of credit for it because he went against his constituency and his party. But the result was a commentary that came out of the aftermath of that was, well, it's really a shame that there will be no United States senator who works for minimum wage. And it's if the limits of your empathy are your personal experience,
that's exactly right.
It's going to inherently be hard for you to govern for people for whom you do not share the same economic and life experience. So it does interest me that the minimum wage seems to be one of the few issues, a living wage rather, is one of the few issues that's transcending the racial barrier, because it does affect so many other people. It's a lot of the discussions about, oh, that's only darker colored people than we, but it turns out that there's lots of commonality on these interests and concerns. And so that's, I agree with you. That's one very good reason to be hopeful, although it's sad that it's a terrible consequence that we can be hopeful that everybody can transcend together rather than they achieve much better, faster. Talk about how white people are the most segregated people in America. And what are the costs about continuing to segregate like this, not just economically, but culturally as well? I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit? And you do in the book.
Yeah. So, this is in taking the story of racism in America, which is so central and so subterranean, and kind of unearthing it and then widening the aperture to enumerate the costs that are not just to the targeted folks. I wanted to talk about segregation, right, which is, the primary way that in the post-enslavement era, Black and white folks were separated and allowed for the targeting of resources and the denial of resources, right? It's a major feature of American society. But we often talk about segregation as something that's done to Black people. But if you look at the population statistics, the people who are the most segregated, as in they're most likely to live only with people from their own cultural background and race, it's white folks. And so I in this chapter, Living Apart, I want to ask the question, well, what are the costs of that to our whole society? And, I won't give it all away here, but there are environmental costs of segregation. There are costs, very touchingly, I got to know a bunch of families who had dealt with the quandary of how you educate your child in a system that really all of the incentives are for you to choose a white segregated school. And I got to know a bunch of white or white adjacent parents who had chosen integrated schools.
I'm pondering what white adjacent means, but okay.
Yeah, well, white adjacent means this particular mom was half white and half Japanese.
Okay.
And she felt like a lot of times people would kind of not really know that she was part Asian, and she'd grown up in a very white neighborhood. And
gotcha.
So, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Fair enough. Thank you.
And she had all the resources available to a white family. And so when she was doing her school shopping, when she moved into a new town in Austin, Texas, it was sort of like almost like as a white person. And so I talked to these families, many more than ended up in the book, and they really started to realize that there was a cost that they were paying of systemic racism. And it's really tied to the way that the subsidization of white property and the stripping and theft and denial of Black property has led to massive, disparities in how the home ownership levels in neighborhoods that are Black versus white, and how much houses are valued in a white dominated market. Which means that when you tie how much money goes to schools to the property values in a community, you're just recreating something that was explicitly done in a racist fashion and limiting our children's prospects by that same formula. And it's really inexcusable that we still have that system. And yet these parents were reading the data that says that, particularly for white students, being in diverse educational settings is much, much better for them.
Yep.
That it causes, higher levels of creative thinking and problem solving, and builds empathy and creates better citizens. And all of this was something they were going to miss out on for some test scores. And it really felt to them like they needed to choose what they call global majority schools. And that's schools where it's more representative of the global population.
You describe that as one of the solidarity dividends, I think is your term of phrase.
That's right.
Your coinage there about the benefits of transcending that racial bias and trying to achieve a more just society. I'm going to self-edit my questions because we've got some audience participants that have a bunch of good ones. And so I'm going to talk finally. The final question I'll ask you is, what are some ways that white people can do? What are some things that white people can do to challenge the zero-sum thinking and to address the hidden wound of racism? Again, your turn of phrase, that afflicts all of us, white, black, and all shades in between.
You know, I wrote this book for everyone. One of my favorite kind of words I got back from readers, a white woman was telling me that a black coworker had read the book, given it to her. She read it and she was going to give it to her racist uncle. And I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly who I want to read it. The whole spectrum of folks who are thinking about these issues, who may not think of themselves as implicated in them, and also a way possibly, just possibly, to invite into the conversation people who are living in that zero-sum worldview. I think it's so important. I do think that emblematic stories like the drained public pool are really helpful. But ultimately, you know, the way that we need to, on a person-to-person level, bridge these divides is through storytelling, is trying to deeply listen. And it's hard. I'm by no means
painful for all at times. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm by no means minimizing how challenging it is. But if you can put politics aside and deeply listen to what are the sort of emotional feelings that are animating someone to adopt these racial stereotypes, this anti-immigrant attitudes, this zero-sum thinking, and try to connect on those emotions and then bridge to what you know as shared values. You both maybe agree that that it's become harder for families to get ahead. You both agree that the world that you want to see is not at hand. You both maybe agree that family is important, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
And then you can start to maybe peel back some of the layers. And then maybe, and I don't know that this is always going to work, but it's very important to me, at least as I go through this world of ours, to remember that racist ideas are being sold for profit all the time by some of the wealthiest people in the world who are behind these big propaganda outlets in our big corporate media. And they're doing the selling for their own profit. And then there are people who are desperate enough to buy those ideas. And I'm more angry at the people who are selling the ideas for their profit than I am at the people who are buying them. And so if you're talking to someone who's buying those ideas, maybe creating some container for a group effort that allows you to be proximate with Black, white, and brown folks in some sort of shared effort that'll make your community better might be a way for everyday on the ground, roll up your sleeves organizing to break through kind of the received wisdom from screens and paid bullies in the corporate media and blowhard politicians. Ultimately, we do all want that connection, that human connection. And particularly coming out of the social distancing of the pandemic over the next 6 months or so, I think people are going to be very hungry for that.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to one of the questions our audience has submitted, very topical one. Lainey asks, as someone who has studied the impacts of the pandemic on women and especially women of color, how do you think the pandemic has exacerbated the economic issues that women of color are experiencing? While the rise of the social justice movement this past summer really got white people invested in Black Lives Matter, I worry that the pandemic will keep us from moving past the zero-sum mentality.
Good question. Thank you. So this is really, in my mind, and by this, I mean the incredible job losses, particularly by women, particularly by brown and Black women, is a real example of the drained public pool, right? Why did women have to stop working? Why did women lose their jobs? And it's primarily, and then plunge into poverty or, have to face eviction and all of this. And it's primarily because we haven't updated our public goods and services to recognize the way families work, right? We should have been able to, pay people to be at home safely. If that was the public health imperative,
Right.
we should have paid people to be at home, because people can't just give up work, right? This is not the kind of society we have. We should have had, real support for sick leave and for real healthcare that people can use. All of these things that would have made the economic devastation of just totally freezing our economy would have cushioned the blow, but we haven't done that. Nevertheless, I think we can't get through this conversation tonight without celebrating something, which is that today the House passed the Senate version of the bill, and therefore it's headed to the president's desk, the American Rescue Plan, which includes $1,400 survival checks, which includes, for the first time, mixed status households, right? Someone where one of the parents or some member of the family is on their pathway to citizenship. And that's so important. $300 a week extra unemployment insurance benefits, and not taxing the $10,000 of unemployment insurance benefits that people may have gotten over the last year. Something that is just so mind-boggling and so wonderful I can barely contain myself, which is the fact that we are going to be able to cut child poverty in half.
Right.
For Black, white, and brown communities where childhood poverty is in the 30s and 40% rate, we're going to be able to cut it in half because of $300 a month checks to families who have to deal with the fact that having a child becomes this major predictor of poverty and bankruptcy, because we haven't refilled the pool of public goods for the way that families live now. Reopening schools money, vaccines money, nutrition and food aid so that children and families aren't going hungry this summer, expanded subsidies to knock people's healthcare bills down, more money for Medicaid expansion so that some of these states that refuse to expand Medicaid, which is itself a very racialized resistance, which I talk about in the book, are now going to be making $2 for every dollar that they spend on Medicaid. There are all of these great things. And it really is a bill that has 70+% support in the American public, even though it's majority support among Republican voters and no Republican members of Congress voted for, which is just unbelievable to me. But it really goes to show how much they're betting on the zero-sum story to keep them in power and keep them in their seats, even though they're not delivering for the American people. And it really is just something to celebrate. It's something that is got something for everyone, white, Black, and brown, and also recognizing that, we're not all standing at the same depths in the bottom of that drained pool, right? There's money for Indigenous communities who've been particularly hard hit by the pandemic.
So there's a positive. Katharina asks, in a discussion last April with One World, along with Ta-Nehisi Coates, you said, laws at their core are just expressions of beliefs. Can you discuss that a little bit here? And I think it goes along with what you had to say about how young we are and how we're still at the founding era of our country, which is an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way, but we are.
Wow, Katarina, thank you so much for the thoughtful question and for, tuning in and remembering something I said from last spring. I do truly believe that. And that's why, I felt like the statistical tools of just bringing the numbers to the decision makers and having them do the right thing was not working, because there's, rational economic self-interest, and then there's beliefs, which are totally irrational.
Right.
And, those beliefs are the beliefs in a value, a hierarchy of human value, the belief that some groups of people are better than ours, the belief, and this is very relevant for issues of poverty and economic insecurity, that there's something wrong with people who are struggling to make ends meet, and that they are doing something different with the same set of circumstances than you would do. And what's that distancing mechanism that makes you think, oh, it's something wrong with them, not something that's wrong with their employer who pays them a poverty wage, And that race is often that, right? It's like, oh no, there's something different about you. And that's how poverty gets racialized. And even when it's non-Black and brown people who are poor, there is that sort of scaffolding that's set up to distance people who are economically more comfortable, and certainly the 50% millionaires who are in the United States Senate, for example, from people who are struggling. And it's that lack of solidarity, that lack of empathy, that lack of understanding that we are all part of the human race, and we're pretty much wired in the same way and want the same things. And anything that you would want to make yourself comfortable, you should.
So too, you want for everybody else. Yeah, great. Thanks for the thoughtful and insightful book. What role do you see community parks playing in today's conversations about creating relationships across diverse groups? We've seen a lot of disturbing headlines where racial bias is in full display on those public spaces where people of color are simply out enjoying birding or nature and find negative consequences for playing in that grassy area over the filled-in pool.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is real. I mean, with the barbecuers in Oakland and obviously Christian Cooper, who was bird watching, these public spaces have always been contested, right? They've always been policed by these racial lines and a real sense of kind of white ownership over them and a suspicion of a Black presence in them. I think that is something we're just going to have to get over, right? It's so important that, if I think about the world I want to see, the kinds of the world we need to address climate change, to address the jobs crisis, to give our young people who are right now graduating and being saddled with debt and not meaningful work something to do that feels like they're part of something bigger than them. I think we should have a national public service jobs program so that people can be rebuilding our public goods. And that includes more parks and more childcare centers and more schools and more, public health corps, right? We keep seeing these vaccine disparities. We should be paying people to go door to door and get people the vaccines, right? Like we've got the people, we've got the need, let's make it happen. And that's the kind of, broad vision of a public good that I think we need to lean into. And it is so much often the mentality of scarcity that creates that, fierce contesting for the little bit of public good that we have. And we need to really broadly expand it.
Well, getting a little more provocative here in the sense of something that tends to be a third rail is crime and criminal justice. And there's some mentality when it comes to sentencing reform and how many white people reject criminal law and criminal reform or calls to defund the police and any permutation of what that means on the grounds that it will threaten white public safety and encourage the proliferation of theft, drugs, crime, of all its manifestations. Is there a way to address that with the notion of the zero-sum mentality and expanding consciousness on it?
Thank you for the question.
And that was Nate, I should say.
Thank you, Nate, for the question. I do talk a little bit about that in the book because white fear is one of the most powerful forces in maintaining the zero-sum racial hierarchy, because it really can always be manipulated by politicians, as we saw in 2020. Ultimately, I think it's really important, and this is where the data geek in me comes back. If you control for poverty, there is no difference in crime victimization rates in Black communities or white communities, in rural poor communities versus urban poor communities, right? This is what it's about, right? We can either make sure that people are not in poverty and give people meaningful lives and meaningful work and meaningful opportunities, or we can have a lot of crime. And when we talk about defunding the police in order to refund the kind of public goods, services, and supports that make life great, all we have to do is look at well-funded suburbs. And that's what it should look like, where the police is a really small part of the budget, where you're actually investing in great houses and great sidewalks and great parks and great schools and lots of community amenities. And where people have a little bit of a wealth cushion and money in the bank, the kinds of money in the bank that was denied to Black people for generations. And that really does mean the difference between, losing a paycheck for 2 weeks and then ending up out on the street versus not, right? And so I truly believe that these issues of crime and punishment, first of all, the mass incarceration system has come for white America too. It is absolutely an example of, a system that was set up to destroy Black people, Black families, and Black communities, now rolling into white communities as well. In fact, it's always been the case that the majority of people arrested, only 2/3 are white, but we're now seeing, harsher sentencing and drug-related crimes and property theft that was related to drug crimes going up in white communities because of the deindustrialization. And it's like, if you don't have jobs and you don't have good public services, that's what happens. And so the refilled public pool is good for everyone.
Yeah. Wow. Frank asked, how can truth, racial healing, and transformation movements gain traction in a nation that is so politically divided? He says he sounds kind of hopeless about it.
Oh, no, Frank. Well, thank you for either reading the book or having heard me talk about it and know this solution that I come upon in the book. It's a framework that my mother actually created, but I spent a lot of time with communities that were doing it. And the one that I chose to profile in the book is in Dallas, Texas. A lot of the people who are involved in the Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort are Republicans, are folks who have, when they start the process, have a lot of bias, have a lot of distrust, have a lot of reasons to oppose the process, reasons to feel threatened by the idea of racial truth-telling. And one of the reasons why I think this idea is so potentially powerful is it's not the same thing as a kind of blue ribbon commission in Washington. And that's the kind of thing that is easily funneled through the Fox News machine, and Republicans say they hate it, and then it's over, right? And it never reaches any grassroots Republican or conservative folks because it's already been sort of branded as some, big Democrat thing or something like that.
Creeping socialism.
Exactly. But if you can start, if you can get these efforts going at the community level, right, where you have school teachers and librarians and police officers and doctors and nurses and, just service workers and community folks together in these racial healing circles, telling their own stories, you start to see people connect on a human level and see the world differently. And I think that's the power.
I'm struggling to do justice to all the great questions our audience is participating. And I know I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to probably have to end with one more. And hopefully this will enable us to end on a very positive note. Laurel asks, this summer we saw lots of white people coming to and be energized and coming to the streets, literally and figuratively, about learning about racial inequity and racial injustice. It was a vast expansion of the constituency who was willing to hear that message and to put their voices into that conversation. Yeah. How do we keep that going?
So I would say this in general, these past 4 years has been a massive surge in people learning anew what it means to be a citizen of a community and what it takes. It means that we spend our civic time like you guys are tonight on a Wednesday night. Instead of just turning on Netflix and vegging out, you're actually engaging with the ideas that are relevant to your community and your lives and politics and our history. And the way that so many tens of millions of people recognized, I've got to actually do something about this. I've got to educate myself. I've got to lift up my voice. I've got to organize. I've got to get involved. That's really the power, right? When that happens, the impossible is possible. I mean, Georgia sending 2 Democrats to the Senate, which enables this massive relief bill to cut child poverty in half, is possible because people organized. And so, and I think it's all connected, right? Black Lives Matter is deeply connected to these issues of of our democracy, and making sure we can have a multiracial democracy, and making sure that we have people in power who care about cutting child poverty in half, right? These things are all really connected. And so I do believe that the energy of the streets has obviously dissipated, but people are changed because of it. And importantly, the avenues and opportunities for people to do that kind of cross-racial solidarity organizing that I saw being such a factor for change in folks' lives and really changing policy, it's still there. And the movements, whether it's the women's movement, the Fight for 15, the movement for vaccine equity or racial justice, are all still very alive. And you just have to pick one thing. Get involved. Make sure you're spending 2 hours a week, 4 hours a month, whatever it is, actually talking to your neighbor and trying to move the ball on something. It's incredible how the power of just that choice multiplies. And it's the only thing that's ever saved us. And it's the only thing that ever will.
That sounds like a perfect place to end this conversation, but I'm going to do that by starting by saying thank you so very much for spending your evening with us, Heather. I think you've been your book, The Sum of Us, again, for those of you who haven't gotten a copy, it's in its second printing. It's a wonderful book, tells great stories. It's challenging. At some points, it's frankly kind of painful to read, but it's important reading for all of America. Thank you for being with us tonight. My apologies to all of the people who asked questions that we didn't have time to get to. I hope that some of the answers Heather gave addressed some of the concerns you raised in those things. Fauquier, Rappahannock, Culpeper, Path is engaging these conversations on a continuing basis. We hope you'll participate with us, and we thank you very, very much for joining us tonight. So take care, everybody.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Path, and thank you to the community. Really appreciate you being with me tonight. Take care. Be safe.